Today we bring you 5 criminal cases that are as shocking as they are true. If you find this content engaging, don't forget to leave a like and tell us which city and country you're watching from. Thank you for joining us in this investigation. Now let's dive into the cases. William Dennis, Halloween mortal. Imagine it's Halloween night. As your family prepares for bed, there's a knock at the door. You answer, expecting a child in costume asking for candy. But what steps inside isn't a trick-or-treater. It's a silent figure wearing a wolf mask and holding an axe. What happens next is so brutal, so inhuman, that even the most seasoned detectives would never forget it. Why would someone commit such an atrocity? And how could that terrifying figure turn out to be someone they had once known? William Michael Dennis and Doreen Herbert, formerly known as Doreen Dennis, met in the late 1970s. She was a young woman with simple dreams and the hope of starting a family. He appeared to offer the stability she longed for. They married and soon welcomed a son, Paul. What at first seemed like a solid union began to fracture. The marriage was far from peaceful. William and Doreen argued frequently, and the tension between them grew increasingly toxic. At times, their fights became violent. The atmosphere at home turned heavy and strained. Still, they tried to press on for their child. But in 1982, everything changed in the most tragic way. Their son, Paul, drowned in the backyard pool. It was a devastating accident that left behind irreversible emotional scars. For Doreen, the grief was unbearable. She separated from William, hoping to rebuild her life far from the darkness that haunted them. The divorce was finalized shortly afterward. Doreen moved to a new city, married Charles Herbert, and was expecting a child with him. It seemed she had finally found peace, but William couldn't move on. Trapped in a spiral of bitterness and rage, he was unable to accept the end of their marriage, or the death of his son, though he kept his distance physically. William became obsessively fixated on Doreen's new life. There were no official complaints, no legal confrontations, but those close to Doreen sensed her growing unease. She often spoke of feeling watched, subtly threatened, yet there was no concrete evidence. Meanwhile, William withdrew from everyone. He led a solitary existence, consumed by resentment, silently feeding on the belief that he had lost everything. No one suspected that this quiet, isolated man was meticulously plotting something that would forever alter the lives of those around him. Then came Halloween night, 1984, a night that promised calm, but delivered terror. In the weeks leading up to it, Doreen's life had settled into a new rhythm. She had left behind the shadows of her first marriage and was focused on her home, her husband Charles, and their young daughter. Still, unease lingered. Neighbors reported seeing an unfamiliar car parked near the house at odd hours. Doreen confided in friends that she felt watched, though she couldn't say by whom or why. Her concerns were dismissed as trauma-induced paranoia, but William Michael Dennis had not disappeared. He made no direct contact, but subtle signs of his presence emerged. Mutual acquaintances recalled seeing him lurking near the neighborhood, always silent, always staring. Tensions mounted as Halloween approached. An anonymous phone call warned police of a possible threat, but without evidence, no action was taken. What unfolded that night defied logic and surpassed the worst fears. Doreen, unaware of what was to come, prepared Halloween festivities for her daughter, who skipped through the house in her costume. Life seemed normal, though it teetered on the edge of catastrophe. The night of October 31, 1984 was quiet on Palo Drive in San Jose. The stream of costumed children had dwindled. Halloween lights still flickered, but most homes had settled in for the night. Inside one house, Doreen Herbert, nearly 8 months pregnant, rested beside her husband Charles and their little girl. At around 9:30 p.m., a knock came at the door. Charles stood to answer it. On the porch stood a figure, seemingly in costume, but it wasn't a child, it was a grown man. He wore a wolf mask. He said nothing. He didn't ask for candy. He was holding a brown paper bag when Charles opened the door. The man pulled an axe from the bag and struck him directly in the head. A swift, brutal blow. Charles collapsed to the floor, dazed and bleeding from an open wound with no time to think. He managed to get up and, stumbling, fled through the back of the house. He escaped through the rear door and reached a neighbor's home, where they called emergency services. He was bleeding, but alive. Meanwhile, the attacker entered the house and headed straight for the bedroom. There, Doreen lay alone. Pregnant and defenseless, she had no time to react. The man attacked her with the axe, delivering a series of devastating blows. He didn't speak. He didn't scream, he simply struck. It was a swift and lethal assault. Within seconds, the room was soaked in blood, but what followed was even more chilling. The killer didn't stop at murder. After taking Doreen's life, he sliced open her abdomen and removed the unborn child from her womb. a baby that would have been born in just a few weeks. He left the lifeless infant at the scene. This cruel, calculated act was no impulse, it was an extension of hatred, a deliberate message. Not only will I kill you, I will destroy the child you're carrying, because it's not mine. All of this happened while Charles and Doran's young daughter slept in another room. She was unharmed. She heard nothing. She only awoke later. When the police had already arrived, the killer exited the house through the same door he had entered. He left no weapon, no mask, only a scene of unthinkable horror. Police arrived within minutes. They found Charles injured in the neighbor's house. When they entered the home, what they discovered in the master bedroom was a bloodbath. There was blood on the walls, the sheets, the floor. Doran's body was mutilated, and next to her lay the small, lifeless body of the unborn child. Officers escorted the little girl out of the home in her pajamas. She couldn't comprehend what had just happened. The killer left few physical traces behind, but one thing was clear. This was no robbery, it wasn't random, it was deeply personal. Detectives questioned Charles at the hospital. Barely able to speak, he clearly uttered one name: William Michael Dennis, Doran's ex-husband, the father of the son they had lost years ago. The man who never accepted the divorce. The one who had threatened to kill Doran if she ever had a child with another man. The man who knew exactly where she lived. The man who loathed everything she had managed to rebuild. There was no real list of suspects, there was only one. And the officers knew they had to find him that very night, after the savage attack at the Herbert residence. Police acted swiftly. Charles's emergency call and eyewitness account were critical. Though wounded and disoriented, he was able to clearly describe the attacker, a man in a wolf mask wielding an axe. The crime scene was carefully examined. Bloodstains were found throughout the house, particularly in the bedroom, along with subtle clues pointing to the killer's identity. Pieces of the mask and partial fingerprints. At the hospital, Charles underwent further questioning, despite his head injury. He confirmed without hesitation that his ex-wife's former husband, William Michael Dennis, had made prior threats and harbored deep hatred, especially regarding Doran's pregnancy. Doran and William had a complicated history: a failed marriage, the tragic death of their child, and a separation marked by bitterness and unresolved anger. Police quickly tracked William to his home. There, they discovered blood-stained clothing and other evidence linking him directly to the murder scene. The wolf mask, dropped during his escape, was also recovered and became a key piece of evidence. During the arrest, William remained cold and distant. He didn't deny the allegations, but he didn't confess either. In subsequent interrogations, he either stayed silent or downplayed his role. The prosecution built a strong case. The forensic report revealed horrifying details. Doran had suffered multiple axe wounds causing immediate death and the death of her unborn child. The post-mortem removal of the baby was highlighted during the trial as a particularly savage and symbolic act of cruelty. In court, testimony was harrowing. Charles recounted the attack and the repeated threats they had received from William. Neighbors testified about previous violent arguments. Forensic experts meticulously detailed every wound, proving the crime was planned, not a sudden outburst. The trial lasted several weeks. The defense tried to argue mental illness, suggesting the attack was a moment of insanity, but the evidence spoke of premeditation. The mask, the weapon, the timing, the motive, the use of an axe, the precise timing of the attack, and the killer's intimate knowledge of the family's routine all pointed to one person. Ultimately, the jury found William Michael Dennis guilty of first-degree murder and fetal homicide. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This case left a lasting scar on the community and the Herbert family, who were forced to endure unimaginable loss and trauma. The young daughter, physically unharmed but emotionally marked, grew up beneath the shadow of that Halloween night that changed everything. Dalma Rojas betrayed by flies. Imagine living on a quiet street in the heart of Asunción, Paraguay. An old house stands proudly, full of history. But something feels wrong. A putrid stench hangs in the air and a swarm of flies circles endlessly. Uneasy neighbors begin to wonder what secrets lie behind those walls. On October 8, 2018, police broke into the house and discovered a horrifying scene. 5 bodies, all in advanced stages of decomposition. The victims: Dalma Rojas Rodas, 23 years old, her 2 young children, aged 4 and 6, her mother, Elva Graciela Rodas, and her father, Julio Rojas del Valle. From that day on, the residence became known as the House of Horror. Dalma, a young woman passionate about mixed martial arts, was well known in her community. Her partner, Bruno Maribel, 19, was quickly identified as the prime suspect. What appeared to be a typical family hid disturbing secrets that soon came to light. Investigations revealed that the murders occurred between September 29th and October 2nd. Dalma was the first victim, followed by her mother, Elva, who was attacked with a hammer. Next were her two children, Salo and Christian. Finally, her father Julio was murdered when he returned home. Bruno attempted to conceal the bodies using lime and cement, but the stench and the flies betrayed his crime. For an entire week, he continued living in the house with a new partner, Araceli Sosa, who had no idea what had taken place. He even sold the victims' belongings and maintained his daily routine as if nothing had happened. Authorities uncovered damning evidence, including text messages and audio recordings sent by Bruno in an attempt to build a false alibi. One audio clip contained the agonized cries of a victim, which became a critical piece of evidence in court. The case shocked the entire nation and ignited a national conversation around domestic violence and mental health. Bruno Maribel was ultimately convicted of aggravated intentional homicide and sentenced to 40 years in prison. When police forced their way into the house in downtown Asunción, the first thing they noticed was the overwhelming stench of decay and the swarm of flies. What they found inside exceeded their worst expectations. Scattered across various rooms between mattresses, old furniture, and dried bloodstains were 5 bodies in an advanced state of decomposition. One was that of Dalma Rojas Rodas, just 23 years old, though it was October 8, 2018. Forensic analysis suggested the murders had occurred 6 to 10 days earlier. From that point forward, the investigation quickly honed in on the prime suspect. Bruno Maribel, Dalma's partner. Their relationship was intense, but also marked by frequent arguments. Bruno, 4 years younger than Dalma, projected the image of a stable partner. But close friends later revealed that Dalma had expressed a desire to leave him. Dalma lived in the house with her 2 children, her mother Elva and her father Julio, but for days no one had heard from any of them. What raised suspicions was that Bruno continued to use the house, transforming it, disturbingly, into his hideout. Not only did he remain there, he invited another woman, Araceli Sosa, and introduced her as his new partner. Araceli testified that she had noticed nothing unusual, other than the persistent smell. Bruno allegedly told her his in-laws had gone to Encarnacion and blamed the odor on a dog urinating and soiling the house. She recalled him using excessive amounts of disinfectant and acting visibly anxious. She also noted that he frequently left at night, supposedly to get food or make sales. Later, police confirmed that during that time, Bruno sold some of the victims' household items on social media. One neighbor testified that Bruno offered her a clothes iron at a suspiciously low price, claiming he needed money to move in with his new girlfriend. What no one could have imagined was that, just meters away from where children played and neighbors sipped coffee, the remains of an entire murdered family lay hidden. In the days following the discovery, forensic examiners determined that Dalma had died from multiple blunt force trauma wounds to the head. Her mother, Elva, showed signs of having been attacked with a heavy object. A hammer, later recovered at the scene. The children had been asphyxiated, and Julio Rojas was attacked days later when he returned home. Likely unaware of what had already taken place inside, prosecutor Marcelo Saldivar, one of the first to address the public, described the crime scene as a massacre, stating that in his career he had never encountered anything comparable. Investigators quickly formed a hypothesis. Bruno had likely killed Dalma first, and then murdered the rest of the household to eliminate witnesses. Some of Dalma's relatives speculated that Bruno had premeditated the killings, and that his motives were not solely emotional but also financial. At the time, this remained under investigation. When forensic teams examined Dalma and Bruno's phones, they uncovered a series of increasingly hostile text exchanges. In the days leading up to the murders, Dalma told Bruno she no longer wanted to be with him, and that he had to leave the house. Bruno's responses were confused and ominous. One message read, "I don't want you to leave. If you're not mine, you won't belong to anyone," disturbingly. Audio recordings were also recovered, one of which became key evidence during the trial. In the clip, a female voice can be heard screaming for help. Although Bruno denied recording or sending the file, forensic experts proved that it had been shared from his WhatsApp account just hours after the first killing. The public ministry's timeline was thorough and chilling. Dalma was killed on September 29th, Elva the following day, the children on October 1st, and finally, Julio Rojas on October 2nd, when he returned from Encarnacion, walking unknowingly into what had become a house of horrors. Even as the killings unfolded, Bruno continued to live in the home. He used the bathroom and kitchen, chatted with neighbors, posted on Facebook, and even sold items online. all while corpses decomposed around him. His behavior shocked even the most experienced forensic psychologists. The house was saturated with evidence: bloodied clothing, stains on the walls, broken objects, and clear signs of struggle. Yet Bruno initially escaped detection. He carried on with his life until someone finally contacted authorities, reporting the overpowering smell. When officers arrived, he was gone. Days later, he was arrested in downtown Asunción, walking casually, carrying Dalma's cell phone. The media frenzy surrounding the case was overwhelming. The public trial of Bruno Maribel became one of Paraguay's most closely followed legal proceedings in recent memory. It wasn't just the brutality of the crime that horrified the public. It was the cold, calculated normalcy with which the accused lived among the dead, hiding his actions behind a mask of daily routine. From the moment of his arrest, Bruno displayed bizarre and contradictory behavior. In his initial statement to prosecutors, he denied everything, claiming he had no knowledge of the killings. He insisted that when he left, everyone in the house was alive. He said he had gone out to look for work and later visited a friend. But that version of events fell apart almost immediately. Security footage from nearby businesses captured Bruno repeatedly entering and exiting the house, even after the supposed date of his departure. Cell phone analysis confirmed that during the days of the murders, Bruno not only stayed in the home, but used Dalma's phone to send messages, pretending she was still alive. In one such message, Dalma supposedly told a friend she had gone on a trip with her parents. But the writing style didn't match hers. It lacked her usual expressions and signature emojis. Even more telling, the messages had been sent using the home's Wi-Fi. Another damning detail: prosecutor Marcelo Saldivar presented extensive evidence. The bloodied hammer found hidden behind a wardrobe, DNA traces from the victims on Bruno's clothing, and the disturbing audio recordings now publicly available. The most harrowing moment came when the key audio was played in court. As the tribunal listened to the desperate screams of a woman begging for help, Bruno remained completely emotionless. Witnesses later said they saw judges visibly shaken by the recording. The victims' relatives also testified. Aunt of Dalma, through tears, stated that Dalma had previously asked for help, that Bruno manipulated her emotionally, and that she had been trying to leave him, but feared what he might do. She was scared of him. She knew what he was capable of, the aunt said. Another critical detail came from a neighbor who reported hearing screams in the early morning hours just days before the bodies were discovered. She had dismissed them at the time, assuming it was yet another domestic argument. One of the most unsettling aspects of the trial was the testimony of Araceli Sosa. Despite living with Bruno in the house during the days when the bodies were already decomposing, she insisted she had no idea what had happened. She claimed she was in love with him, noticed he was acting strangely, and seemed anxious, but never imagined anything so horrific. Araceli stated that Bruno told her the house was dirty, and that the smell was from spoiled food and a sick dog. However, both prosecutors and journalists questioned her account. How could someone live in a house containing 5 rotting corpses, sleep there, and not notice anything? How could she enter a home where the floor was covered in lime, strange stains marked the walls, and flies swarmed relentlessly, and yet sleep through it? The defense portrayed her as just another victim, a naive young woman deceived by a manipulator, but many found her version implausibly innocent. During the trial, Bruno's legal team shifted strategy. After initially denying all involvement, his attorney requested a new statement. This time, Bruno confessed to killing Dalma, but insisted it was not intentional. He claimed they had argued, that she struck him first, and in a moment of rage he hit her back. Then, according to him, he panicked. He said he didn't know what to do, and when his mother-in-law confronted him, everything went black. From that point on, he claimed to remember very little. The prosecution dismantled this narrative. They demonstrated with forensic evidence that the victims had not been killed all at once, as Bruno alleged, but over a period of several days. First Dalma, then Elva, followed by the children, and finally Julio when he returned home. This timeline suggested clear premeditation, at least in part. Investigators also uncovered efforts by Bruno to conceal the crime, cleaning the scene, using disinfectants, purchasing lime to hasten decomposition. These were not the actions of someone in shock, but rather the calculated moves of a man trying to erase evidence. Forensic psychologists concluded that Bruno exhibited narcissistic traits and a manipulative personality. No signs of mental illness were found that could exempt him from criminal responsibility. He was, they determined, fully aware of his actions, And perhaps most disturbingly, he never showed remorse. One of the trial's most debated topics was the motive. Why did he do it? The prosecution argued the motive was rejection. Dalma wanted to leave him. She had thrown him out of the house, and he simply could not accept it. But this was not just a crime of passion. Bruno's cold, calculated behavior after the murders pointed to a secondary financial motive as well. He sold items from the home, used Dalma's phone to impersonate her, even attempted to rent out the house to a new tenant just days after the killings. On September 3, 2020, 2 years after the murders, the Sentencing Tribunal of Asunción delivered its final verdict. Bruno Maribel was sentenced to life in prison. The decision was unanimous. He was found guilty of aggravated intentional homicide with multiple victims, premeditation, and extreme cruelty. There were no doubts. The evidence was overwhelming. Throughout the trial, Bruno attempted to portray himself as a man caught in a moment of chaos. He claimed to have acted in shock with no plan, no control. But the forensic reports, witness testimony, and digital evidence told a different story. Each murder was committed with precision and calculation. The judges emphasized the brutality of the crime, the methodical way in which each family member was executed, and the disturbing reality that Bruno continued living among the corpses. He used lime to mask the odors, clean bloodstains, and all the while posted on social media and sold the victims' possessions. He never once expressed regret. The sentence brought a sense of relief to Dalma's surviving relatives. One of her aunts, speaking outside the courthouse, told the press, "It won't bring Dalma back, but at least he'll never walk free again." The entire country followed the case with a mix of horror and disbelief. For weeks, the media referred to it as the Asunción Massacre, a name that still sends chills down the spine. Bruno Maribel was transferred to Tucumbu prison, where he remains in isolation for his own protection. He has not spoken publicly about the case since. This crime left behind unanswered questions that time has yet to resolve. Was it a moment of violent impulse or a premeditated act of evil? Could someone have intervened sooner? And how was it possible that no one noticed what was happening in that house for so many days? We may never know. But what is certain is this: behind those lime-coated walls lies a story of horror that left an indelible mark on Paraguay, a senseless, brutal act of domestic violence that claimed 5 lives and was heard by no one. Do you truly believe Bruno acted alone? Was Araceli merely a bystander or something more? Let us know what you think in the comments. The farmer monster. Imagine your neighbor, quiet, reserved, the kind of man who greets you with a nod each morning. Now imagine that this same man had been hiding a series of crimes for years, acts so disturbing they would shake any community to its core. Willem van Eyck was born on August 13, 1941 in the small rural village of Korteraar in South Holland. He was one of 8 children in a farming family who made a living through livestock and seasonal fieldwork. From a young age, Willem was perceived as different. The local children were unsettled by his erratic behavior and social withdrawal. Nicknaming him Willem de Gek, Willem the Mad, he spent much of his childhood alone. The family lived in a modest farmhouse surrounded by agricultural land. Willem attended primary school in Ter Aar, but his academic performance was poor, and he showed little interest in learning. By the age of 8, he was already known for acts of cruelty toward animals, beating birds with sticks, drowning cats in the canals, and disemboweling frogs. Some neighbors even reported seeing him preserve animal carcasses in glass jars behind his home. In adolescence, Willem dropped out of school and began working odd jobs in the fields. He moved through various areas in western Netherlands, especially around Alphen aan den Rijn and nearby towns. He had no close friends. Though he had a few brief relationships with women, none lasted. He lived with his mother, who was highly protective and described him to others as merely misunderstood. His father had passed away in the mid-1960s. By the early 1970s, Willem had no criminal record, but he was frequently seen riding his moped through back roads, often stopping near bus stops to offer rides to young women. At that time, hitchhiking was common in rural parts of the Netherlands, particularly among teenagers. The first disappearance linked to Willem occurred in June 1971. Cora Mantel, a 15-year-old girl, had left her home in Alphen aan den Rijn to visit her boyfriend in Amsterdam. On her return, she missed her bus and decided to hitchhike near the road to Waddinxveen. She was last seen getting onto a moped driven by a man in his 30s. Her body was discovered days later in a ditch outside of Ter Aar. The autopsy revealed she had been strangled with her own scarf. The case went cold. There were no strong suspects and the physical evidence was limited. But 2 years later, a second murder changed everything. On August 19, 1974, Ali van der Plas, a 43-year-old sex worker in Alphen aan den Rijn, was found dead in a cornfield between Zwammerdam and Ter Aar. Her body was partially covered with an agricultural tarp and bore multiple stab wounds to the abdomen and torso. One of her nipples had been removed. Police discovered moped tire tracks at the scene along with fresh drag marks. Several witnesses reported seeing a man on a moped nearby wearing blood-stained clothing. The man's description matched Willem van Eyck. The moped was a red Puch Maxi, common for the era, but it was registered in Willem's name. When police visited his residence, they found him living with his mother on a white houseboat moored along a canal in Ter Aar. On the side of the boat, in red spray paint, were the words "Vrijheid," freedom. The paint dripped downward, resembling trails of blood, something that immediately stood out to officers. Willem was cooperative but visibly nervous. In his room, police found a jacket with dried stains, a woman's scarf that didn't belong to his mother, and newspaper clippings about Cora Mantle's disappearance. He was arrested a few days later. Confronted with the evidence, Willem confessed to both murders. He claimed to suffer from uncontrollable urges and insisted he acted alone. He admitted to strangling Cora and stabbing Ali, stating that he had picked them up while driving along rural roads and had not known them beforehand. The autopsy of Ali revealed that she had been attacked with a kitchen knife with forceful, repeated blows. There were also traces of duct tape on her wrists, suggesting she had been restrained. Willem never explained the removal of the nipple. During the trial, the prosecutor suggested the act might have been ritualistic or symbolic, though no additional evidence was found to confirm this theory. In 1975, Willem was convicted of both murders and sentenced to 18 years in prison. He served his time in Scheveningen prison and later in a rehabilitation center in Bekkel. Due to good behavior, Willem was released early in 1990 after serving 15 years. Willem van Eyck was released in 1990 after serving 3/4 of his sentence. He was 49 years old. He settled in the municipality of Harkstede, in the province of Groningen, in the northern Netherlands. There, he rented a house on the outskirts of the village, in a sparsely populated area. He lived alone, received welfare assistance, and did not hold any steady job, occasionally working in gardening and maintenance. Despite his prior convictions, Willem's name remained active in police records as a high-risk repeat offender. Still, for several years after his release, he appeared to stay out of trouble. However, the local police would later receive sporadic reports from women who claimed to have been followed by a man in a white van near rural roads between Hoogezand and Sappemeer. All victims described the man as having a Western Dutch accent and wearing a cap. No official charges were filed at the time. Then, on July 3, 2000, police discovered the body of Anne de Ruyter, 30 years old, on the bank of a canal near Kolum, just outside Groningen. Anne was a sex worker who had last been seen the previous night in the red light district of Nieuwstad. Her body was partially buried in soil near a row of poplar trees. She had suffered multiple stab wounds to the upper torso and neck. There were signs of strangulation, and parts of her underwear had been removed. None of her personal belongings were recovered. At the scene, investigators found tire tracks and traces of a short-handled shovel. 2 weeks later, on July 17th, another woman, Annelies Reinders, 24 years old, went missing. Like Anne, she worked the streets of Groningen and had a history of drug use. Witnesses last saw her entering a windowless white van. 5 days later, a farmer discovered her body in a field on the outskirts of Ten Boer. The scene bore haunting similarities: multiple stab wounds, signs of strangulation, and a shallow trench dug with hand tools. This time, the killer had covered the body partially with branches. Both murders followed a nearly identical pattern. Young women engaged in sex work, similar fatal injuries, bodies discarded in rural isolated areas. A special police unit, Team Groenwelden, Greenfields Task Force, was assembled to investigate the case. Based on tire impressions and soil samples from the victims, authorities determined that the vehicle involved was likely a white Volkswagen Transporter, manufactured in the 1980s. A public alert was issued, urging citizens to report similar vehicles. Meanwhile, a breakthrough came from the National Criminal Archives. An investigator reviewing unsolved cases with similar patterns discovered that Willem van Eyck, who had lived in the area since 1990, had previously been convicted in the 1970s for crimes that followed the same modus operandi. A discreet surveillance order was approved. During surveillance, Willem was repeatedly seen driving a white Volkswagen Transporter, slowly circling the outskirts of Groningen's red light district. He was also observed stopping in remote wooded areas without any clear purpose. On November 22, 2001, police executed a search warrant at his Harkstead residence. Inside the house, they found incriminating evidence: women's clothing stained with blood, a shovel with soil matching the type found at both crime scenes, newspaper clippings related to the murders of Anne and Annalise, Polaroid photographs of unconscious naked women, some visibly injured, and most chilling of all, a personal diary in which Willem had written disturbing entries such as, "She screamed again. I silenced her. Everything was calm. The earth gave her back to me." Blood traces were also discovered in the back of his van. Though degraded with time, DNA tests conducted on skin fragments found under one of the victim's fingernails matched Willem's genetic profile. He was arrested that same day while feeding his dog in the garden. During interrogation, Willem confessed to the murders of Anne and Annalise, but he went further, admitting responsibility for the murder of a third woman, Fiena van den Akker, a 26-year-old who had gone missing in 1993. Her body had never been recovered. He led investigators to a wooded area near Glimmen, south of Groningen, and directed them to the exact burial site. There, over a meter below ground, authorities unearthed skeletal remains and clothing matching the missing person report from 1993. Willem's confession resolved 3 more cases and prompted police to reopen at least 5 additional unsolved homicides in the region. Willem van Eyck was formally charged with the murders of Anne de Ruyter, Annelies Reinders, and Fiena van den Akker. Dutch prosecutors built their case not only on forensic and physical evidence, but also on his criminal history and the near-identical pattern of killings in the 1970s and 2000s. The trial began in 2002 at the Assen District Court. Despite having confessed during police interrogations, Willem partially recanted during trial, claiming that his confession had been coerced and that no eyewitnesses had seen the killings. However, the forensic evidence was overwhelming. In the case of Anne de Ruyter, forensic soil analysis revealed that the exact type of clay found where her body was buried matched the soil residue on the shovel recovered from Willem's home. Tire tracks from the scene also matched the wear pattern of the rear tire on his van. In Annelies Reinders' case, fragments of skin found beneath her fingernails yielded a genetic profile that matched Willem. Willem's DNA matched 11 out of 13 markers used by the National Forensic Institute. The prosecution also submitted handwritten excerpts from Willem's personal journal, entries filled with details only the perpetrator could have known. In one passage, he described a blonde woman with a tattoo on her ankle, a fact never released to the public but consistent with Annelies's description. Another entry referred to a woman crying for her child before disappearing, something Anne's mother had told the press, that her daughter often spoke of leaving prostitution to regain custody of her 4-year-old son. During the trial, the victims' families were permitted to address the court. Anne's mother declared, "My daughter wasn't perfect, but she was a person. She didn't deserve this. He discarded her like trash and lived peacefully for years as if nothing happened. I haven't had a single night of restful sleep since she vanished." A key witness was a neighbor of Van Eyck who testified anonymously. He had seen Willem returning home in the early hours on multiple occasions, wearing soiled clothing and gloves. He never reported it out of fear, but after the arrest, he felt compelled to speak out. Prosecutors also presented a transcript of a phone call Willem made to an acquaintance weeks before his arrest, commenting on news of a body found in Ten Boer. He said, "Seems like you can't even bury someone in peace anymore. They're always digging where they shouldn't." Though not direct evidence, the statement reinforced the psychological profile of the accused. Willem van Eyck was found guilty of all 3 murders. On June 18, 2002, the court sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In the ruling, the judge noted that Van Eyck had demonstrated a persistent pattern of serious criminal behavior, and that his release in the 1990s had resulted in additional victims. During his transfer to the prison in Vught, Willem showed no remorse or emotion. Later reports from the prison system confirmed that he never accepted moral responsibility, nor expressed regret. His behavior was described as calm and methodical, though he showed little interest in communal activities. He spent long hours alone in his cell, writing in notebooks and reading gardening books. The case sparked intense criticism of the Dutch reintegration system, particularly for allowing a convicted multiple murderer to be released without thorough psychological evaluation. In response, the Netherlands later revised its policies regarding the review of long-term sentences and implemented stricter protocols for repeat offenders with violent histories. As for the victims' remains, all 3 families chose private burials. Anne and Annelies were laid to rest in Groningen. The remains of Figanina van den Akker, once confirmed via DNA, were cremated according to the wishes of her elder sister, who resided in Belgium. The Van Eyck case remains one of the most harrowing criminal sagas in Dutch history, not only due to the brutality and continuity of the crimes, but also because the justice system failed by releasing a man who had already proven capable of killing vulnerable women. Elizabeth Fox, she planned something terrible with her lover. No unusual activity had been reported in the area, and neighbors claimed they had not seen anyone suspicious in the hours leading up to the incident. However, Elizabeth's demeanor soon began to arouse suspicion. She stated that she had heard noises during the night, sounds reminiscent of fireworks, but claimed she never got out of bed to investigate. Moreover, she did not call emergency services until nearly 7:00 a.m., when she stepped outside and discovered her husband's lifeless body lying at the entrance of their home. This nearly 5-hour gap between the suspected time of the shooting and her 911 call immediately raised red flags for investigators. Officers also observed that Elizabeth exhibited no outward signs of distress. While this alone was insufficient to implicate her, it was nonetheless unsettling enough to warrant closer scrutiny. Upon examining her phone, investigators discovered a deleted call made at approximately 12:03 a.m., just minutes after the murder, which had not been included in the call logs she had submitted. Forensic analysis later revealed the call had been placed to Larry Richmond Sr., a convicted felon with whom Elizabeth had been involved in a long-standing extramarital affair. Larry Richmond was no stranger to the justice system. He had previously served time for armed robbery and firearms trafficking. At the time of Robert's murder, he was on parole with strict conditions prohibiting both weapons possession and contact with other felons. Complicating matters further, Richmond was also engaged to Elizabeth's sister, making their clandestine relationship all the more scandalous. The deleted phone call and the romantic involvement between Elizabeth and Richmond led investigators to scrutinize their communications more closely. Over the weeks leading up to the murder, they had exchanged frequent messages, many of them in the early hours of the morning. Several messages hinted at anger, frustration, and cryptic allusions to getting rid of the problem. Investigators began connecting the dots. Elizabeth was the only person who knew her husband's exact work schedule, and that he would be arriving home late that specific night after a long shift. This critical detail, combined with Larry's criminal background and access to firearms, suggested the crime may have been premeditated. However, one key piece remained missing: the murder weapon. The case took a dramatic turn when Larry Richmond Jr., the son of the suspect, confessed to police that he had stolen a firearm from a pawn shop and given it to his father just days before the murder. Although the revolver, a .38 caliber, was never recovered, investigators unearthed fragments of other firearms buried in Larry Sr.'s backyard. The presence of these weapons alone violated his parole. But more importantly, the casings recovered from the crime scene matched the type of ammunition used in the stolen revolver. At this stage, the authorities had sufficient evidence to keep both suspects under close watch. But it was a prison cell confession that ultimately solidified the case. While in pretrial detention for violating his parole, Larry Sr. shared a cell with an inmate who was also a confidential informant. In a recorded conversation, Larry admitted to killing Robert and revealed that Elizabeth had helped orchestrate the plan. Not for money, but out of emotion. She was tired of her marriage, he said, and we were just looking for a way out. This taped confession transformed the investigation. What had initially appeared to be circumstantial, an affair, deleted messages, and suspicious behavior, was now corroborated by a direct admission of guilt. In May 2022, Elizabeth Fox Dewar was formally arrested. Her face appeared across local news outlets. The grieving widow who had once tearfully pleaded for justice on television was now the primary suspect in a plot to murder her husband, aided by her lover. Elizabeth's arrest sent shockwaves through a family already reeling from loss. For Robert's children, the ordeal was agonizing. Not only were they grappling with the permanent absence of their father, but they were also being forced to confront the fact that their stepmother, a woman who had shared meals, vacations, and family traditions with them, was now accused of conspiring to take his life. From the beginning, investigators were careful in their approach with the children, who were emotionally divided. Some continued to believe in Elizabeth's innocence, while others, particularly the older children, had long harbored doubts. One of them recalled overhearing a heated argument weeks before the crime. Though the details were unclear, he described a strange tension between his parents, something wholly uncharacteristic. According to him, Elizabeth had seemed increasingly distant and disengaged. Robert's daughter, Lindy Griffin, emerged as one of the most articulate and resolute voices throughout the trial. When asked how she had endured the uncertainty in the years leading up to the trial, she replied candidly, "You learn to live with the pain, but never with the absence. You get used to the emptiness, but you never stop searching for answers." During her testimony, she spoke of her father as a man of integrity, gentle, devoted, and unwavering in his love for both his work and his family. She described growing up watching him suit up each morning to face fires and disasters, and how he never failed to make them feel safe. What devastated her most, she said, was the realization that his death had not been a random tragedy, but a carefully calculated act perpetrated from within the walls of his own home. Nathaniel Guthrie, Elizabeth's biological son and Robert's stepson, also took the stand. His perspective was more complex. Although he admitted he hadn't shared a particularly close bond with Robert, he acknowledged and respected the role Robert had played in their household. "He wasn't my biological father, but he was the man who raised me. He wasn't my biological father," Nathaniel testified, "but he was the man who was there while I grew up. He taught me things my own father never could. And when I learned the truth, it felt like everything shattered." Nathaniel admitted feeling betrayed, not only by his mother, but also by the very idea of family he had built around her and Robert. "I don't think I'll ever fully trust anyone again. I'll never be able to forgive her for being the reason my siblings and I lost the family we grew up with." These testimonies left a deep impression on the jury and public alike. The image of a family devastated, not only by the brutal death of a father but also by internal betrayal, became the tragic symbol of the case. Local media wasted no time in reporting every detail of the trial, focusing particularly on the fall from grace of a woman who, for many, had simply been the wife of a local hero. What disturbed Robert's relatives most was Elizabeth's apparent lack of remorse. She remained emotionless during every court appearance. She never cried. She never apologized. Even when given the chance to speak in her own defense during sentencing, she only used it to reaffirm her innocence. "I never asked anyone to kill my husband. This is all a misunderstanding. I'm not guilty of these charges." Her voice was calm, her tone cold. For Robert's children, it felt as though she had killed him all over again. But this time she had taken the whole family with him. One of Robert's brothers also took the stand. He recounted that in the days before his death, Robert had expressed feeling watched. As though someone knew his every move, he had changed his route to work several times and had even commented that Elizabeth had been acting strangely, but he had never suspected she would wish him harm. "My brother was a good man, too good to imagine that someone in his own home could be plotting to kill him." Elizabeth's own family, in contrast, remained silent. Her sister, the same one who had been engaged to Larry Richmond, refused to testify. Some local outlets reported that the engagement ended abruptly just weeks after the murder, but no one from the Fox family spoke publicly. The trial had evolved into more than a criminal proceeding. It became a kind of public reckoning. A ritual in which the emotional wreckage of a family was laid bare. There was no overt hatred directed at Elizabeth. What prevailed was an overwhelming sense of grief, as if everyone was still trying to make sense of when exactly everything broke apart, and why no one had seen it coming. The trial of Elizabeth Fox Dewar officially began in 2023, 4 years after the crime. While public opinion had long favored her guilt, the prosecution understood it would need to build an airtight case. Elizabeth had not pulled the trigger. Her fingerprints were not found at the scene. Thus, her involvement had to be proven through conspiracy to commit murder, a charge that required clear evidence of intent, communication, prior acts, and knowledge of the crime. The prosecution opened by establishing the romantic link between Elizabeth and Larry Richmond. They presented recovered text messages, phone records, and even handwritten letters. Some of the messages were filled with passion and longing. Others, more incriminating, hinted at Robert as an obstacle. "He doesn't understand you like I do," Larry had written. Elizabeth replied, "I wish it were easier, but you know what I want," though not direct confessions. Within the context of the crime, the implications were chilling. One of the most tense moments in the trial came when prosecutors played the recording obtained by a jailhouse informant, an audio clip in which Larry Richmond Sr. openly admitted to killing Robert and claimed Elizabeth had known what would happen. "I wouldn't have done it if it weren't for her. She wanted it. She needed me to do it." His voice was unmistakable. The jury listened in utter silence. Defense attorneys attempted to discredit the recording, arguing that it had been manipulated by an inmate seeking a legal advantage. However, forensic experts confirmed its authenticity. Larry's son, Larry Jr., was also called to testify. He admitted to stealing the weapon used in the murder, though he claimed he was unaware it would be used to commit a crime. Nevertheless, once he found out the truth, he remained silent for years about what had happened. As he later explained, he feared for his safety. He had seen his father assault people, speak of revenge, and live on the edge of legality. Yet, a part of him believed that by cooperating, he might be able to close a painful chapter. In his statement, he said, "I'm not a hero. I'm just trying to do the right thing, though it's far too late for that now." Prosecutors also presented a series of deleted calls from Elizabeth's phone. These weren't isolated incidents. In the hours leading up to the murder, at least 5 communications were identified between her and Larry. One call occurred precisely at 2:03 a.m., just 1 minute after the shooting. Elizabeth never offered a clear explanation for that call, claiming she didn't remember it. The defense argued it was a coincidence, but coincidences like that rarely persuade a jury. It was also established that Elizabeth knew Robert's schedule intimately. In fact, she was the one who insisted that he return home that night instead of sleeping at the fire station, as he often did. She told him she had a surprise for him. Instead of a gift, he was met with bullets. The defense attempted to sow doubt. They claimed Elizabeth had no real motive to want Robert dead. They minimized her relationship with Larry, dismissing it as lacking seriousness. They even suggested that Larry might have acted independently, driven by jealousy or his violent nature. However, there was no evidence supporting such a theory without also implicating Elizabeth. Every road, direct or indirect, led back to her. A turning point came with the testimony of an FBI digital behavior analyst who had reviewed phone records. She revealed that Larry's phone had pinged from a location just 2 blocks from the Dewar residence for approximately 45 minutes on the night of the murder. No one could explain his presence there, not even Elizabeth. The trial lasted 3 weeks. In closing arguments, the prosecution was unequivocal. She may not have pulled the trigger, but without her, this murder would not have happened. The defense urged the jury to consider only concrete facts. Let's not punish a woman for having an affair. Let's not convict her because her partner was a dangerous man, but the jury needed little time. After fewer than 5 hours of deliberation, Elizabeth Fox Dewar was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. The judge imposed a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Her coldness, her silence, her denial of the facts, and the emotional toll on Robert's children all weighed heavily against her. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Elizabeth showed no tears, only a blank stare, as if reality had yet to catch up with her. For Robert's children, it was justice, delayed but justice nonetheless. As one of them later said, "None of this brings him back, but it lets us sleep a little easier." After the verdict, a profound stillness settled over the city of Evansville. This was not merely the conviction of a widow for the murder of her firefighter husband. It was the implosion of a local family, the unraveling of a household, and a stark reminder that even those closest to us may harbor the darkest intentions. The Evansville Fire Department endured a particularly painful period. Robert Dewar had served more than 30 years. He was respected not only as a firefighter but as a human being. He had been part of the volunteer reinforcement units that responded to the 9/11 attacks. He had saved lives, mentored young recruits, and left a legacy. Many of those he trained attended the trial. Several testified, not as witnesses to the crime, but as character witnesses for the man they had known. One of them, Captain Jerry Franklin, put it best. "If Robert had your back, you knew you were getting out alive." Not many people inspire that kind of trust. When it was revealed that his death had been orchestrated from within his own home, grief gave way to a blend of rage and disillusionment. A memorial plaque was installed at his station. Each year, on March 22nd at exactly midnight, the time of his death, a siren has sounded in his honor. But the story wasn't over. There remained the matter of Larry Richmond Sr., the man who carried out the murder. Tried separately, his own proceedings unfolded in parallel to Elizabeth's. Although his defense team tried to negotiate a plea deal, prosecutors insisted on a full trial. Unlike Elizabeth, Larry did not exude arrogance. He appeared subdued, almost defeated. When asked if he had anything to say, he simply responded, "I did what she asked. I shouldn't have, but I thought it would give us the life she promised me." He too was sentenced to life in prison, with eligibility for parole at age 75, a practical life sentence. Elizabeth remains incarcerated. Now in her 50s, she has no possibility of parole. She has never given a public interview nor issued a formal apology. Some believe she still denies any involvement. Others suspect she has chosen silence as her new way of existing. Mark van Dongen, the acid attack that shocked the world. Imagine you're in your bedroom in the middle of the night when a blood-curdling scream pierces the silence from the street below. As you rush to the window, you see a man in his underwear, the skin on his face and torso visibly melting. This is not the opening scene of a horror film, but the harrowing reality that befell Mark van Dongen. Mark van Dongen was a young civil engineer from the Netherlands, bright, personable, and with a promising future. In 2010, he moved to Bristol, England, where he met Berlina Wallas, a South African fashion designer, 18 years his senior. At first, nothing seemed amiss. They were two consenting adults with different personalities but an apparently functional relationship. Over time, their bond deepened, and Mark moved into Wallas's apartment. They shared a home, a daily routine, but behind closed doors, something began to unravel. According to friends of Mark, Wallas grew increasingly controlling. She would routinely check his messages and demand constant reassurances of loyalty. If he spoke with other women or came home late from work, she accused him of betrayal. These weren't ordinary relationship arguments, but rather signs of a toxic dynamic that weighed heavier with each passing day. Still, Mark remained for 5 years, perhaps out of habit, emotional entanglement, or an inability to perceive the danger. Wallas's behavior became more erratic. She experienced sudden mood swings, resorted to emotional manipulation, and frequently threatened self-harm. On several occasions, Mark found her crying inexplicably or screaming at no one. Yet whenever he considered leaving, she found new ways to make him stay. Everything changed in 2015 when Mark met another woman, Violet Farquharson. This time, the connection was genuine and mutual. Mark chose to be honest with Wallas. Their relationship had run its course, and he wanted a new beginning. There was no infidelity, just a clear and respectful decision to move on. Wallas, however, refused to accept the breakup. She began bombarding him with calls and messages, claiming to be gravely ill. She told him she had cancer, that she was dying alone, and needed him by her side. Though no longer in love, Mark continued to visit out of compassion, not affection. Wallas alternated between vulnerability and aggression, sometimes pitiful, other times vicious. Her messages were contradictory. One day she begged for reconciliation, the next she hurled insults. In one chilling text, she wrote, "If you don't love me, I'll kill myself, and you'll regret leaving me forever." Simultaneously, Wallas began conducting disturbing internet searches, not once but repeatedly. She looked up chemical substances, the effects of acid on human skin, and legal concentration thresholds. She took screenshots, made notes, and visited forums explaining how to acquire corrosive agents without arousing suspicion. But Mark knew none of this. To him, she was simply a volatile ex who couldn't handle rejection. In September 2015, Wallas called him again. She pleaded with him to stay the night, claiming she was emotionally unwell and couldn't bear being alone. Mark, perhaps out of lingering guilt, agreed. That night, Mark van Dongen arrived at Wallas's flat, as he had done many times before. But this time they were no longer a couple. He was only there because she had begged for help, claiming she felt weak and needed someone beside her. He had no idea what she had planned. There was no argument, no yelling. Mark took a shower, changed into comfortable clothes, and got into bed. Wallas did the same. All seemed quiet, but in the adjacent room, hidden inside a closet, was a bottle that would alter the course of many lives. Wallas had ordered it online days before, carefully concealing her identity and labeling the purchase as a metal cleaning agent. The container held concentrated sulfuric acid, one of the most corrosive substances known to science. A single drop can burn through flesh and bone. She knew exactly what she was dealing with. She had studied it. She saved images, read instructions, and even viewed photographs of real acid attack victims. Nothing about what happened next was spontaneous. In the early hours of September 23, 2015, Wallas got out of bed, retrieved the bottle, and opened it. Carefully, and without making a sound, Wallas approached while Mark was fast asleep. He didn't stir, didn't speak. He suspected nothing. Then, without any warning, she walked up to the bed and hurled the contents of the container directly onto his face. The acid struck first his face, then spread to his chest, shoulders, neck, and thighs. In less than 2 seconds it began searing through his skin. Mark awoke in a state of shock, screaming and trying to make sense of what was happening. The pain was beyond comprehension. "What have you done to me?" he screamed. Wallas replied coldly, "I told you, if you couldn't handle my love, you'd feel it instead." According to later reports, Mark stumbled out of the bedroom, disoriented and in agony. He managed to make it down the stairs completely naked, desperately seeking help. Though he made it outside, he could no longer see. The acid had damaged his eyes. His skin hung in bloody strips, blistered and bubbling. As though he were being cooked alive, he crawled down the street screaming, "She's thrown acid on me, please help." Neighbors rushed out, horrified and confused by the terrifying sight. One of them immediately called emergency services. The dispatcher instructed them to pour water over him. When paramedics arrived, Mark was still conscious, though barely able to speak. His tongue was swollen, his mouth scorched, and his lips grotesquely disfigured. Later, doctors would confirm he had suffered burns over more than 25% of his body, including his face, neck, chest, and tongue. Meanwhile, Wallas remained in the apartment, calm and composed. When police arrived, she offered no resistance and showed no signs of distress. "He told me to leave him," she said, "so I showed him what it feels like to be abandoned." That was one of her first statements. The acid she had used was so concentrated that even after hours of rinsing, it continued to cause damage. Mark was placed under heavy sedation and then induced into a coma. His left eye had been completely destroyed, the right severely damaged. He couldn't move. His neck muscles were burned, his jaw nearly melted away. He lost a leg, could no longer eat, speak, or swallow without assistance, and yet he survived. In the weeks that followed, Wallas was arrested and charged with grievous bodily harm. But the story didn't end there. What followed was not just a legal trial, it was a profound ethical dilemma, one that no one wanted to face but that Mark could no longer ignore. Can a body continue to live when the life it once knew has ceased to exist? Mark van Dongen survived the night of September 23, 2015, but what followed was far from a life. He was transferred urgently to Southmead Hospital in Bristol, one of the few medical centers in the UK equipped to handle such extensive burns. He arrived conscious but barely able to speak. Doctors sedated him immediately to prevent total collapse from pain. They couldn't make any promises. His left eye was obliterated, his right severely impaired, and the acid had not only destroyed his skin, but also the underlying muscles, nerves, and bone tissue of his face and torso. His tongue had been so badly damaged that he couldn't eat or swallow on his own. He was fed through a tube and placed on a ventilator. His left leg became fatally infected and was amputated. He spent days unable to communicate. Meanwhile, his father, Kees van Dongen, flew in from the Netherlands to be by his side. Kees was the first to see him in the ICU. Mark's face was swathed in bandages, his skin visibly damaged, the air heavy with the lingering scent of chemicals. Still, when Kees spoke, Mark cried. He was alive, and aware of everything. Slowly, doctors began to bring him out of sedation, but the process was painstaking. Mark eventually learned to communicate by moving his head, lifting his fingers, and later writing with great difficulty. The first thing he conveyed was that he didn't want Wallas anywhere near him. The second, he wanted to die. But it wasn't that simple. In the United Kingdom, euthanasia is illegal. No one, not even in cases of extreme and irreversible suffering, may lawfully assist another in ending their life. Mark wanted to, but the law would not allow it. He wanted to die. He begged to be taken to Belgium, where euthanasia is permitted under certain conditions. He had legal residency there. Perhaps he could find an end, while doctors continued to assess his condition. Police were gathering evidence. In Wallas's apartment, they found the empty acid bottle, incriminating internet searches, and something even more disturbing, her personal diary. Scattered throughout were entries like, "If he leaves me, he'll pay. I'll get revenge with everything I've got. Let him stay with that slut. We'll see who's laughing then." Screenshots on her computer included pages detailing acid attacks, images of victims, and even tutorials. Everything pointed to a carefully premeditated assault. But Berlina denied it all. From the beginning, she claimed Mark had mistreated her, that she only wanted to scare him, and that she had no idea the bottle contained acid. According to her, she believed it held ammonia or bleach, something that would merely irritate his skin. But her purchase records, search history, and behavior told a different story. Wallas showed no remorse. During interrogation, she was cold, defiant, more upset about being in custody than about what had happened to Mark. Meanwhile, Mark's condition steadily worsened. Doctors tried everything: skin grafts, antibiotics, experimental treatments, but nothing succeeded. Infections kept recurring. The pain was unrelenting and there was no sign of recovery. Over time, Mark began to fade. His eyes no longer functioned. His mouth barely moved. He had lost a leg, couldn't swallow, couldn't sleep without sedatives. He was entirely dependent. But he was certain of one thing: he didn't want to live like this. He asked his father to help transfer him, to take him to Belgium and speak with the doctors there. Heartbroken, Kees agreed. After nearly a full year of hospitalizations and suffering, Mark was cleared to travel. A Belgian medical panel reviewed his case, spoke with him at length, and evaluated his mental competence. They concluded that his suffering was both unbearable and irreversible. There was no prospect for a minimally dignified life, and he was fully aware of it. The date was set for January 2017. Mark signed the necessary documents with the one hand he could still move. He was calm, tearless, and had only one final request: don't let the woman who did this to me go free. Hours before the procedure, Kees was with him. He embraced his son, told him he was brave, that he loved him, and that what had happened would never be forgotten. Mark didn't speak, but he squeezed his father's hand. He died at age 29 in silence, surrounded by doctors, not because of the acid, but by choice. On January 2, 2017, Mark van Dongen died by legal euthanasia in Belgium. Until that moment, Wallas had only been facing charges of grievous bodily harm with intent. But with Mark's death, everything changed. The British Crown Prosecution Service was faced with an unprecedented question: could this be legally considered murder? Mark had not died immediately, nor even directly from the chemical burns, but he had died from the consequences of the attack, after over a year of inhuman suffering. Belgian forensic experts concluded that the link between the acid assault and his death was direct and well documented. Based on this, the UK upgraded the charges. Berlina Wallas would now be tried for murder. The defense objected immediately. Her attorney argued that while the attack was severe, there had been no intent to kill. According to him, Wallas only meant to frighten Mark and had mistakenly believed the bottle contained bleach or a cleaning agent. She had never anticipated causing such catastrophic harm, let alone that he would choose euthanasia more than a year later. But the evidence told another story. At her trial in April 2018, prosecutors presented recovered chat logs, her search history, screenshots from her laptop, and excerpts from her diary. All pointed to premeditation. Wallas had planned the attack carefully. She knew exactly what she was using and why. She acted out of vengeance because Mark had left her for another woman. One of the detectives who testified put it plainly. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a premeditated execution. She bought the acid, studied how to use it, threw it on him while he slept, and then watched him suffer. The most powerful moment in court came when Mark's father, Kees van Dongen, took the stand. He spoke of the 15 months of agony his son had endured. I saw him lose every part of himself. First his face, then his speech, his leg, his vision, his independence. And yet he kept fighting until he simply couldn't anymore. He didn't choose to die. He chose to stop suffering. Wallas's legal team tried to claim she suffered from psychological issues and had been a victim of abuse herself, but failed to produce credible evidence. Moreover, no mental health professional who evaluated her during her incarceration considered her mentally unfit for trial. Prosecutors insisted Wallas not only attacked Mark, but later tried to manipulate the narrative, casting herself as a victim, lying about the contents of the bottle, and never showing genuine remorse. After more than 2 weeks of testimony, the jury retired to deliberate. The entire country awaited the verdict. What came next stunned many. Berlina Wallas was acquitted of murder. The jury did not find sufficient evidence to prove that she had the explicit intent to kill, nor that she could have foreseen her actions would ultimately lead to Mark's euthanasia over a year later. Nevertheless, she did not walk free. Berlina Wallas was found guilty of causing grievous bodily harm with intent, a serious offense in the United Kingdom, carrying a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. During sentencing, the judge was unequivocal. This was not a moment of impulse, it was a deliberate act. You disfigured a human being, subjected him to physical and emotional torture, and you did so fully aware of the consequences. Berlina Wallas was sentenced to 15 years in prison with the possibility of parole after serving 2/3 of the term. When the sentence was made public, it sparked outrage. Many, including Mark's family, felt it was insufficient, that true justice had not been served. But from a legal standpoint, all avenues had been exhausted. Mark van Dongen's name became permanently tied to a type of crime that has grown increasingly common and horrific: acid attacks. His story prompted a public outcry for stricter regulations on the sale and possession of corrosive substances in the UK. In the following years, the country enacted tougher legislation. The unregulated sale of certain acids was banned, online access was restricted, and a registry of buyers was introduced. But for Mark and his family, all of this came far too late. Today, his father remains in the Netherlands. He does not give interviews, nor does he seek public attention. He has spoken publicly only once, uttering a single sentence that encapsulates the entire tragedy. He wasn't murdered in a moment. He was destroyed over 15 months, and no one will pay for it the way he